broken girl, marries a stranger. After a public divorce, only to discover he's a millionaire CEO. The air buzzed with excitement, but a nervous tension hung over Clara James as she stood before the mirror in her bedroom. Her wedding dress, the one she had dreamed of for years, felt heavy against her, not because of its fabric, but because of the doubts weighing on her mind. Clara should have been ecstatic. She was about to marry McKinley Lopez, her partner of 8 years. They had built a life together, weathered challenges and celebrated joys. Yet, as the wedding approached, a storm was brewing, one that neither of them had anticipated. It began when McKinley's grandmother, the formidable Mrs. Lopez, entered the picture. Her presence, once a distant influence, became a looming shadow over their relationship. The tension reached a boiling point with a startling request: $70,000 as a gift for McKinley's new BMW. To Clara, this wasn't a gift, but a demand, a transactional imposition that undermined the life she and McKinley had built from scratch. Clara's phone buzzed, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from McKinley. "Hey babe, can we talk tonight? I think we need to sort this out before the wedding." She read the message twice, the words sinking in. Sort this out, she thought bitterly. The situation wasn't about sorting. It was about reckoning with a reality she had been trying to avoid. Mrs. Lopez's request had shaken Clara to her core. She and McKinley had worked tirelessly to build their future, overcoming student loans and financial struggles. Now, days before their wedding, Clara felt as if her contributions and sacrifices were being dismissed in favor of Mrs. Lopez's materialistic whims. This wasn't about generosity, it was about control, a stark reminder of the power dynamics in McKinley's family. As Clara stared out the window at the city bathed in golden light, her thoughts raced. McKinley had always been her rock, calm, steady, and supportive. But his response to his grandmother's request revealed a side of him she hadn't seen before. His loyalty to Mrs. Lopez's authority, even at the expense of their relationship, stung deeply. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she called him. "Hey," McKinley's voice came through, strained and apologetic. "Clara, I'm sorry about everything. I know this isn't easy. I don't know what to do, McKinley," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought we were a team, but now it feels like your family is dictating our future, and I don't know where I fit in." McKinley sighed heavily. "I never wanted this, Clara, but you know how Grandma is. She's always had her way of doing things, and I can't just ignore her. Not now, not right before the wedding." Clara's heart sank. She had supported McKinley through everything, but now she felt sidelined, her love overshadowed by his grandmother's influence. "McKinley, I love you," she whispered, "but I don't know if I can marry you, knowing I'll always come second to her money and power." Silence followed. McKinley's hesitation spoke volumes, and Clara felt the distance between them grow. The following morning, Clara and McKinley sat at their kitchen table, the tension between them palpable. Clara's coffee had gone cold, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. McKinley fidgeted, his guilt evident. "Clara," he began, "I don't know what you want me to say. Grandma's always been like this. She's a Lopez, and she expects things to be done her way." Clara's frustration boiled over. Expected. "McKinley, this isn't about family expectations. This is about control. She's using money to manipulate us, and you're letting her." McKinley looked away, his jaw tense. "It's not that simple. She's the matriarch. She's always made the rules. If I go against her now, it'll ruin everything." "What about us?" Clara demanded, her voice breaking. "What about the future we've been building? Doesn't that matter more than her demands?" McKinley's shoulders slumped. "Clara, I'm trying to protect us. I don't like this either, but I can't just walk away from my family." His words cut deeply. Clara had always known McKinley valued his family, but now she realized how much their influence dictated his actions. It felt like a betrayal, a painful reminder that their love might not be enough to overcome the weight of his family's expectations. The turning point came when Clara overheard McKinley's phone call with Mrs. Lopez. $70,000. he had exclaimed. "Grandma, that's too much." "You don't understand, McKinley, Mrs. Lopez had replied coldly. "This isn't about the money, it's about maintaining the family's status. If you can't handle that, perhaps you're not ready to lead this family." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving McKinley visibly shaken. Clara confronted him, her anger boiling over. "Why do you let her talk to you like that? Why do you let her control you?" "Because she's right," McKinley admitted quietly. "If I can't meet her expectations, I'll lose everything." Clara felt her heart break. McKinley's fear of losing his family's approval was stronger than his commitment to their future. She realized that no matter how much she loved him, she couldn't compete with the power Mrs. Lopez held over him. In the days leading up to the wedding, Clara wrestled with her doubts. She thought about the life she and McKinley had envisioned, the dreams they had shared, but those dreams now felt like illusions, overshadowed by the reality of his family's control. On the morning of the wedding, Clara made a decision. She met McKinley at the venue, her heart heavy but resolute. "I can't do this," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I love you, but I can't marry you, knowing that your family will always come first." McKinley's face fell, his expression a mixture of shock and sorrow. "Clara, please." But Clara shook her head. "I deserve a partner who puts our relationship above everything else. And you deserve the chance to figure out what you really want." As Clara walked away, she felt a mix of heartbreak and liberation. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't compromise her happiness for a life dictated by someone else's rules. In the weeks that followed, Clara began to rebuild her life. She leaned on her friends and family, finding strength in their support. The pain of ending her relationship with McKinley lingered, but she knew she had made the right choice. McKinley, too, began to reflect on his decisions. He reached out to Clara, apologizing for his inability to stand up to his grandmother. While their paths had diverged, their love for each other remained a bittersweet memory. In the end, Clara learned that true partnership required more than love. It required mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to stand together against any challenge. And while her journey with McKinley had ended, Clara's story was far from over. She had found her voice, and with it, the strength to shape her own future. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Clara confronted him. They were sitting together on the couch, the air thick with the tension of unspoken words. Clara had spent the entire afternoon stewing over her thoughts, and now there was no more room for silence. "McKinley," she began, her voice tight, "we need to talk." He looked up from his phone, blinking as if he had been pulled from a trance. He didn't say anything immediately, but the way his jaw clenched suggested he already knew what was coming. "I don't understand," she continued, her hands nervously folding and unfolding in her lap. "Why do you pretend to be someone you're not? You never talk about your family, you never talk about your wealth, and you dress like you can barely afford a bus ticket. I don't get it. I've been patient. I've tried to be understanding, but I can't keep ignoring this. Who are you, McKinley? What are you hiding?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he leaned back on the couch, looking at her with a guarded expression, his lips pressed together in a thin line. Clara could see the discomfort in his eyes, the struggle between wanting to tell her the truth and wanting to keep the secret. His silence was unbearable, like a wall she couldn't break through. "I'm not hiding anything," McKinley said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just don't need people to see me for what I have. That's not who I am." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But everything about his behavior screamed that there was more to the story, that this wasn't the whole truth. "Then why pretend to be poor?" Clara asked, her voice faltering. "Why not just be yourself? You've been doing this for years, McKinley, and I'm starting to wonder if I even know you at all." Her words landed like a slap across his face. He looked away, his hands tightening into fists on the arms of the couch. He was struggling, she could see that, but he didn't know how to let her in. "It's not like that," he said finally, his tone quieter now. I don't want people to treat me differently because of my family or my money. I don't want to be seen as someone who's just riding on the coattails of his family name. I wanted to build something on my own, something real. Clara's mind reeled with his words. So it wasn't just the family dynamics or the pressure from his grandmother. This was about McKinley's identity, the part of him that had chosen to distance himself from everything he had been born into. The wealth, the expectations, the legacy. It seemed like he was running from all of it, trying to create a new persona, one that didn't rely on anything except his own worth. "Then why not tell me, McKinley?" Clara asked, her voice a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Why not tell me about your family? Why the secrets? Why all the lies?" His gaze softened for a moment, but only for a moment. "Because I didn't want you to think that was what mattered to me. I wanted you to love me for me, not for what I can give you, or what I could give to anyone else." The words struck Clara deeply, but the knot in her chest only tightened. Was this really the truth? Was McKinley hiding because he feared that the person she loved wouldn't be enough on his own, that his wealth would overshadow everything? Or was there something darker at play, something more complicated than he was letting on? She didn't know how to respond. She felt the distance between them widening, as if she were standing on one side of a precipice and he was on the other, desperately trying to bridge the gap with words that didn't quite reach her. The days that followed were filled with silence. The more Clara thought about it, the more questions surfaced. If McKinley was truly wealthy, why had he never flaunted it? Why had he pretended to be poor for so long, especially when they were about to marry? And why, despite all the struggles and the contradictions, did she still feel this strange pull toward him? The tension in the air was thick with confusion, and Clara found herself questioning everything about her relationship with McKinley. She had always believed in transparency, in honesty, in a partnership built on trust. But now she wasn't sure if she could trust him, or if she ever really had. One thing was certain: McKinley's secrets were not just about money or status. They were about something deeper. And until she could unravel the truth, their future together seemed as uncertain as ever. The days following McKinley's confession had left Clara in a state of restless uncertainty. The tension between them was palpable, a silent weight that hung over every interaction. McKinley was quieter than usual, retreating into himself, while Clara was left to sift through the puzzle pieces of their relationship. Every conversation seemed like it was missing something, like she was standing in a room full of echoes and shadows, unable to reach the core of what truly mattered. Despite McKinley's promise of honesty, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there were still parts of his story left untold. She wanted to believe in him, but every new revelation only led to more questions. And that was before Alan Sullivan entered the picture. Alan Sullivan had been McKinley's closest friend and business associate for years. To Clara, he had always been the charming, well-dressed man who accompanied McKinley to social gatherings, standing at his side like a silent but constant presence. On the surface, Alan seemed like the picture of success, a suave, calculating businessman with a sharp mind for numbers and investments. He was the kind of person who knew how to make things happen, whether it was sealing a lucrative deal or smoothly navigating the intricacies of a business meeting. But as Clara soon discovered, Alan's charm concealed something darker, something that could potentially destroy the fragile threads of trust McKinley had worked so hard to establish with her. It all started one evening when McKinley invited Alan over for a casual dinner, hoping to break the silence that had settled between him and Clara. He had tried, in his own quiet way, to reassure her that everything would be fine, that they could work through the challenges together. But Clara had learned by now not to take McKinley's word for granted. She was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant digging deeper into his past. As she set the table for dinner, Clara noticed the tension in McKinley's posture. He was distracted, glancing at his phone every few minutes, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he were waiting for something or someone. That someone turned out to be Alan. When Alan arrived, Clara felt an immediate sense of unease. He greeted her with a friendly smile, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like he wasn't entirely genuine. As they sat down to eat, the conversation shifted to business, as it always did when Alan was involved. McKinley seemed unusually tense, carefully choosing his words as he spoke, while Alan carried on as though everything was perfectly normal. But it was when Alan made a seemingly innocent remark that Clara's suspicions were ignited. "You know," Alan said with a smirk, his glass of wine halfway to his lips, "McKinley here could easily afford that $70,000 BMW Mrs. Lopez wants. Heck, he could probably buy the whole dealership if he wanted to." The words hit Clara like a slap across the face. She stopped in the middle of serving herself a dish, her hand trembling slightly as she placed the spoon back down. McKinley froze, his eyes meeting hers in a flash of panic. The silence in the room was deafening. "Alan," McKinley said, his voice tight, "let's not get into that right now." But Alan didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. Instead, he took another sip of wine and leaned back in his chair, as though the topic was no more significant than the weather. "What?" "I'm just saying, McKinley, you've always been one to downplay your wealth, but it's no secret that your family is worth a fortune. Everyone knows it. Hell, the guy's practically a billionaire, Clara." Clara felt her stomach twist into knots. She looked at McKinley, who had suddenly become very still, his gaze fixed firmly on his plate. His jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists on the table. The facade of the man who had always seemed humble, even poor, was beginning to crack, and in its place was something far more complicated, a man who had deliberately hidden his wealth for reasons unknown. Alan's words lingered in the air, and Clara couldn't shake the weight of them. Why hadn't McKinley told her? Why had he gone to such lengths to keep up the pretense of being just another regular guy? And why had Alan, of all people, chosen this moment to reveal the truth so casually, as though it were no big deal? McKinley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. "We don't need to talk about this, Alan. It's not important." Clara's voice broke through the tension, her words sharp and unforgiving. "Is it true, McKinley? Are you really that wealthy? Because you've never once told me that. You've spent 8 years hiding this from me." The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over, and Clara could feel it seeping through her every word. She had given him the benefit of the doubt for so long, but now everything felt like a lie, like the man she had loved for years wasn't the man she thought he was at all. McKinley looked pained, but his eyes were unreadable. He glanced at Alan, then back at Clara, and finally he exhaled slowly. "Yes, it's true. I come from money, but I didn't want to be defined by it. I wanted to build my own life, Clara. I didn't want to be treated like a rich kid or a trust fund baby." Clara stood up from the table, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "You've been lying to me this whole time, McKinley. Why? What else are you hiding? What else don't I know?" Before McKinley could respond, Alan spoke up again, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "You know, McKinley, you've always been too humble for your own good. You really ought to be more upfront about your wealth. People respect that kind of transparency. But then again, you've always had a bit of a rebellious streak, haven't you?" Clara's eyes snapped toward Alan, her suspicion growing with every passing moment. There was something about his tone that didn't sit right with her. He wasn't just McKinley's friend, he was also someone who clearly had his own agenda. The way he spoke about McKinley's wealth, it was too casual, too knowing. Clara didn't trust him. "Alan," Clara said, her voice cold, "maybe you should leave." Alan chuckled, clearly unfazed. "Relax, Clara. I'm just speaking the truth. But I'll leave if you want. I don't want to make things more awkward than they already are." As Alan stood up to leave, Clara's mind was spinning. There was something off about this entire situation, something that went beyond just McKinley's wealth. Alan's interference had only added to the confusion, and Clara was no closer to understanding the truth. The following day, Clara met with her best friend, Nova Bain, hoping that talking to someone who knew her well would help her make sense of everything. Nova was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a keen sense of intuition. She had always been a calming influence in Clara's life, someone who could see through the chaos and offer practical advice. But even Nova's presence couldn't quell Clara's growing unease. As Clara recounted the events of the previous evening, Nova listened intently, her brow furrowing in concern. "So, let me get this straight," Nova said after a long pause. "McKinley is actually loaded, but he's been pretending to be poor this whole time." Clara nodded, feeling exhausted just from explaining the situation. "Yes, and Alan just made it worse by casually throwing it out there like it was no big deal. Why didn't McKinley tell me? Why did he keep this from me for all these years?" Nova bit her lip, clearly deep in thought. "It sounds like McKinley has some serious issues with his family and his wealth. Maybe he didn't want to be tied to it. But that doesn't explain why he's been lying to you." "And Alan?" Nova paused, her eyes narrowing. "There's something off about him. You're right to be suspicious. He's not just a friend, Clara. He's involved in McKinley's business dealings, and I don't think he's as innocent as he seems." Clara nodded slowly, taking in Nova's words. She had always trusted Nova's instincts, and now more than ever, she knew she had to dig deeper into McKinley's past, into Alan's involvement, and into the hidden truths that had been buried for far too long. The more Clara learned, the more the web of deception became tangled. She didn't know who she could trust anymore, and she wasn't sure if McKinley would ever fully reveal the truth. But one thing was certain: the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and the answers she sought might not be as simple as she had once hoped. The days leading up to the wedding were an overwhelming blend of excitement, tension, and confusion for Clara. She had always dreamed of this moment, standing beside McKinley, exchanging vows and starting a life together. But now, with each passing hour, the weight of his secrets seemed to grow heavier. Her heart was conflicted, torn between love and betrayal, trust and doubt. The man she thought she knew had been hiding parts of himself for years, and the closer they got to the altar, the more Clara felt like she was walking down an unfamiliar path. McKinley had become increasingly distant, his once constant presence now tinged with an air of secrecy that Clara couldn't ignore. He was still the man she loved, but now she wasn't sure if she even knew who he really was. The contradictions were mounting. He was humble, but he came from wealth. He claimed he wanted simplicity, yet his actions hinted at something much grander. Clara's mind swirled with confusion, and she began to question whether their relationship, built on years of shared memories, could survive this unraveling mystery. But just as Clara was preparing to confront McKinley again, a figure from his past appeared, someone she hadn't expected, but someone whose presence would shake the foundation of everything she thought she knew about McKinley. The sound of the doorbell rang through Clara's house on a quiet evening, just days before the wedding. She wasn't expecting any visitors, especially not now, when the tension between her and McKinley was so thick. She opened the door cautiously, only to find a tall, distinguished man standing on the other side, Mr. Hayden, McKinley's mentor and a powerful business magnate in his own right. Clara had heard of Mr. Hayden, of course. McKinley had spoken of him often, describing him as a father figure, someone who had helped guide McKinley through the rough terrain of business and life. But she had never expected him to show up unannounced, especially not in the midst of everything that was happening. "Miss James, Mr." Hayden greeted her with a calm, authoritative smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. May I come in?" Clara, still somewhat taken aback, stepped aside to let him in. "Of course, Mr. Hayden, I wasn't expecting you, but please come in." They sat down in the living room, and Clara could feel the tension building in the air. Mr. Hayden was a man who commanded respect. His presence alone seemed to fill the room. He was impeccably dressed, his salt-and-pepper hair neatly combed, his demeanor poised and deliberate. Clara felt a wave of unease, as though something important was about to unfold. "I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here, Miss James, Mr." Hayden began, his voice measured and calm. "I've come because I believe it's time for you to understand the full story. McKinley may not have told you everything, but I think you deserve to know the truth. Clara's heart raced. The truth? What was he talking about? What could McKinley have been hiding that Mr. Hayden felt compelled to reveal? McKinley has always been a complicated young man, Mr. Hayden continued, his eyes steady. He's incredibly intelligent, driven and capable, but he's also been burdened by expectations that come with his family's name and wealth. Clara was silent, waiting for Mr. Hayden to elaborate. The mention of McKinley's family caught her attention. It was the one part of his life that had always been shrouded in mystery. She had learned little about his family, aside from the fact that they were wealthy and well-known, but McKinley rarely spoke of them. His insistence on hiding his wealth suddenly made more sense in the context of Mr. Hayden's words. Mr. Hayden leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. McKinley comes from a very powerful family, one that has built its fortune over generations, but unlike many others in his position, McKinley never wanted to be defined by his family's wealth. He wanted to make his own way in the world. He wanted to prove that he could succeed on his own terms, without relying on the advantages that come with being born into money. Clara's mind began to race. McKinley's insistence on keeping his wealth hidden, his modest lifestyle, it all suddenly seemed like a calculated decision. He had deliberately chosen to keep his background a secret, not because he didn't trust Clara, but because he wanted to be seen as his own person, not just as a rich man. "Does he know you're here?" Clara finally asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Why hasn't he told me any of this?" Mr. Hayden paused, his gaze steady as he considered his words. "McKinley has always been a private person. He's not one to share his personal struggles easily. He wanted to build a life with you, Clara, not based on the wealth he was born into, but based on who he is, what he's accomplished on his own. He didn't want you to love him for his money. He wanted you to love him for himself." Clara's heart tightened. She felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. All this time, McKinley had been protecting her from his family's legacy, hiding a part of himself that she never knew existed. But why? Why hadn't he trusted her with this? Why hadn't he let her in? Before she could voice her questions, the door opened behind them, and McKinley stepped into the room. His face was pale, his posture tense. He had clearly been listening from the hallway. "Clara." McKinley's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Mr. Hayden is right, I should have told you. I've been a coward." Clara turned toward him, her emotions swirling. "Why, McKinley, why keep this from me? All these years you let me believe we were the same, just two people in love, trying to make it work. But you weren't honest with me. You lied to me." McKinley's face fell, the guilt evident in his eyes. "I didn't lie, Clara. I didn't want you to love me for the wrong reasons. I didn't want to be just the rich guy to you. I wanted you to see me for who I really am. I wanted to build something with you, without the shadow of my family's expectations hanging over us. But in doing that, I've made you feel like I wasn't being honest with you, and for that, I'm sorry." Clara's heart ached as she looked at him. The man she had loved for so long, now revealed in a way that was both unexpected and painful. She wanted to believe him, to understand why he had done this. But the hurt was still fresh, the sense of betrayal still lingering in the air. "I don't know what to believe anymore, McKinley," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "All this time, I thought I knew you, but now I'm not sure who you really are." McKinley stepped forward, his eyes pleading for her forgiveness. "Clara, I'm still the same person. I'm still the man you fell in love with. Nothing has changed except for the truth. I don't want you to be upset about my wealth. I want you to be upset about the fact that I didn't trust you enough to share it with you sooner." There was a long silence as Clara processed his words. It was a lot to take in, the revelation, the emotions, the years of secrecy. She had always known that McKinley was more than he let on, but she had never imagined that this would be the truth. It wasn't just his wealth that had been hidden from her, it was his entire identity. But as she looked at him, standing there with a look of vulnerability she had never seen before, something inside her began to shift. She realized that this was the man she had fallen in love with, not the wealthy heir or the mysterious figure, but the man who had tried to protect her from a world he didn't want her to be a part of. McKinley. Clara's voice was soft, the anger fading into something more complicated. "You've hurt me, but I think I understand why you did it. And I still love you. I don't want to lose you over this. But we need to be honest with each other from now on. No more secrets. Can you promise me that?" McKinley's face softened and he nodded. "I promise, Clara. No more secrets. No more hiding." The room felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of their unresolved tensions had been lifted. But Clara knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like they were on the same page, honestly and openly facing the future together. As they stood there, with Mr. Hayden watching quietly from the sidelines, Clara realized that the journey ahead would be one of healing, understanding, and new beginnings. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow across the room where Clara sat, her thoughts tangled like the vines that had once grown freely in her grandmother's garden. The day had broken, but Clara still found herself trapped in the night before the long conversation with McKinley, the shocking revelation, the flood of emotions that followed. Her heart was heavy, weighed down by the tension of the past few days, but it also felt lighter in places. Pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but it was hard to determine what the picture would look like once all the pieces fit. Clara stared out the window, her gaze lost in the horizon, the city bustling in the distance, oblivious to the emotional storm unfolding inside her. She had never imagined that McKinley, the man she loved, had kept such a monumental secret. The wealthy heir of a family she barely knew, someone she thought she could trust to be open and honest with her, how could she have missed the signs? But now, after McKinley's confession, Clara had to step back and take a hard look at their relationship. She realized that their love wasn't defined by wealth or material things. Over the years, they had built a bond based on shared experiences, laughter, and even hardship. It wasn't the money that had drawn her to him, but the quiet moments when he opened up, when they shared their dreams and fears. Those were the moments that had made her fall in love with him. She rubbed her temples, trying to make sense of everything. Yes, she had felt betrayed, and yes, the secrecy had stung. But as she reflected on McKinley's reasons, his fear of being reduced to a stereotype, of being loved only for his wealth, Clara couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. Wasn't it love that had motivated his actions all along? His desire to be seen for who he truly was, not just the sum of his bank account and family name. She sighed, the weight of the decision ahead beginning to settle on her shoulders. Could she forgive him? Could she understand his desire for authenticity, even at the cost of secrecy? More importantly, could she see beyond the wealth and accept him for who he was now, not for the man she had imagined him to be? It was a tough question, but as Clara glanced at the clock, she knew she didn't have all the time in the world. The wedding was fast approaching, and so was the confrontation she had been avoiding for weeks, the one with McKinley's grandmother, Mrs. Lopez. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself standing at the door of Mrs. Lopez's house, a place she had visited many times, but had always been filled with an air of unease. Mrs. Lopez was a woman who commanded attention the moment she entered the room, her sharp gaze assessing everyone around her. Clara had never quite fit in with her, always feeling like an outsider in a world where money and status ruled everything. But now, with McKinley's secrets laid bare, Clara needed answers. Mrs. Lopez's house was opulent, the kind of place where the walls seemed to whisper about generations of wealth and power. Clara had always admired the grandiosity of it, but today it felt suffocating. The ornate furnishings, the paintings that depicted generations of Lopez ancestors, they all spoke of a lineage that Clara could never quite grasp, a world she never felt part of. When Mrs. Lopez appeared, She was the picture of controlled elegance, her perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry matching her icy demeanor. "Clara, how lovely to see you," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something colder beneath the surface. "I assume you've come to discuss the wedding." Clara took a deep breath before speaking. "Actually, I'm here to talk to you about McKinley." She kept her voice steady, despite the turmoil she felt inside. "I think we need to address something important." Mrs. Lopez raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What could possibly be so urgent, my dear?" "It's about the money," Clara said, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "The request you made for the BMW gift. McKinley told me everything." For a moment there was a flash of something in Mrs. Lopez's eyes, surprise perhaps, or maybe guilt, but it was quickly masked by her usual composure. "I see," she said, her tone cool. "And what exactly did he tell you?" Clara stepped closer, her voice firm. "He told me that he comes from money, that he's been hiding his wealth from me all this time, and he told me that the reason you asked for the gift was to maintain the family's honor, as if that's the only thing that matters, but it's not. It's never been about money for us. We've built something real, Mrs. Lopez, and this obsession with status, this demand you made, has only hurt McKinley and me." Mrs. Lopez's face hardened, but Clara could see the slight tremor in her hands, betraying the fragility of her carefully constructed facade. "You think I don't know what this family needs, Clara?" she snapped. "Do you think I don't understand what it takes to keep us at the top, to maintain the legacy that has been built over generations? Money is everything. Without it, we're nothing. And McKinley needs to understand that." Clara shook her head, her voice quiet but resolute. "No, Mrs. Lopez, money isn't everything. It's not what makes a family. It's love and respect and trust. McKinley deserves to be loved for who he is, not for the name he was born with. He deserves to be free of the pressure you've put on him his entire life." Mrs. Lopez's lips tightened into a thin line, but for the first time Clara saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "You're wrong," she said sharply, but the conviction in her voice was wavering. "You don't understand the pressure we've faced, what McKinley will face. I only wanted the best for him." Clara took a step forward, her voice softening. "But in the process, you've only created more pressure, more expectations. You've put him in a position where he feels like he can't be himself. He's been hiding, not just from me, but from everyone. And it's not right." There was a long pause, the silence hanging heavy in the room. Finally, Mrs. Lopez's stern expression faltered, and she let out a long, weary sigh. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted him to have what I never had, to carry the family name with pride. But I see now, I see that I've pushed him too hard. I've made him feel like he couldn't be who he truly is." Clara's heart softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Mrs. Lopez's arm. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Lopez. But it's never too late to change. McKinley needs you to understand him, not control him." Mrs. Lopez looked down at Clara's hand for a moment before lifting her gaze. There was a vulnerability there now, one that hadn't been present before. "I never wanted to lose him," she whispered. "I only wanted him to be strong. I thought strength came from wealth and power. But maybe it comes from love." Clara nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Mrs. Lopez had just admitted. It was a significant shift, one that Clara hadn't expected, but it was a step in the right direction. As Clara left Mrs. Lopez's house later that afternoon, she felt a quiet sense of relief wash over her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had taken a big step forward, both in understanding McKinley's past and in beginning to heal the rift with his grandmother. There were still many conversations to be had, but for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a flicker of hope. Love had never been about wealth or status. It had always been about connection, understanding, and the willingness to face the truth, no matter how difficult it was. Clara knew that the road ahead would be rocky, but she was ready to walk it with McKinley side by side. The days leading up to the wedding felt like a whirlwind of emotions, a delicate balance between hope and uncertainty. Clara woke up that morning feeling a quiet sense of calm, the kind that only comes when a decision has been made, even if it's not the easiest one. She had spent countless hours reflecting, dissecting every conversation with McKinley, every moment of doubt, and every ounce of frustration. She knew that what lay ahead was not just about the wedding, but about choosing a path that would define the rest of her life. McKinley had been transparent with her, finally revealing the truth behind the secrets he had kept for so long. His reasoning, his desire to be loved for who he was, not for his wealth, had struck a chord deep within her. It wasn't the money that had drawn her to him, it was the connection they had built over the years. But even so, the weight of his family's expectations, the shadow of his grandmother's demands, and the lingering fear of betrayal had all clouded her judgment. Clara had felt lost, adrift in the sea of emotions, trying to find her way back to the man she had fallen in love with. But now, everything was clearer. McKinley wasn't perfect. He was flawed, just as she was. But he was sincere, and his love for her was real. They had built something strong, something worth fighting for, despite the challenges that life had thrown their way. As Clara gazed at her reflection in the mirror, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The woman looking back at her was no longer someone caught in the whirlwind of secrets and misunderstandings, but someone who had come to terms with her past and was ready to step forward into the future. She walked over to the window and looked out at the bustling city below. The sun was shining brightly, and the world seemed to be moving at its usual pace, unaware of the personal transformation she had undergone in such a short time. The wedding was still hours away, but Clara already knew what her heart had decided. She was ready to marry McKinley, not because of the secrets he had hidden, but because of the person he had shown himself to be. When McKinley arrived at Clara's house that afternoon, his face was a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had been nervous ever since their last conversation, wondering if Clara would be able to forgive him, if she could accept the truth behind his actions. He had expected anger, disappointment, maybe even a sense of betrayal. But now, as he stood at the door and saw Clara waiting for him, there was something different in her eyes. Clara walked toward him with a smile, one that was soft, yet filled with warmth. "Hi," she said, her voice steady but tender. "Hi," McKinley replied, his voice low. "Are you okay?" Clara nodded, taking his hand. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you. About us." McKinley's heart skipped a beat. And I've realized something," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I love you. I've always loved you. And nothing is going to change that." McKinley's face softened, a mixture of relief and disbelief flooding through him. "Clara." He took a step forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to build something real with you, something honest." "I know," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. I needed to understand. I needed to know that the love we have is real, and not because of the money or the family or anything else." McKinley's thumb traced the curve of her cheek as he nodded. "I wanted that too. I wanted you to love me not for what I have, but for who I am. And I'm sorry it took me so long to show you that." They stood there for a moment, lost in the silence of shared understanding. Then Clara smiled, her eyes shining with the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. "I think we've both learned a lot through all of this," she said. "About ourselves, about each other." McKinley smiled back, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I've learned that love isn't about hiding who you are. It's about being honest, being vulnerable, and I'm ready to be that with you." Clara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around his hand. "Then let's move forward. Let's stop looking back." Later that evening, Clara and McKinley stood together in the grand hall of the venue, the final preparations for the wedding taking place around them. It was everything Clara had ever dreamed of, the soft glow of candlelight, the elegant flowers lining the aisles, the soft hum of conversation as friends and family gathered to celebrate. But there was one person who had yet to arrive, one person who Clara still wasn't sure would show up. Mrs. Lopez. As the matriarch of the Lopez family, her presence was paramount. The idea of a wedding without her blessing seemed almost impossible, especially after everything that had happened. Clara had heard nothing from Mrs. Lopez since their last conversation, and though she felt a sense of peace about her decision to move forward with the wedding, there was still a part of her that felt anxious about her grandmother-in-law's approval. Just as Clara's nerves were beginning to fray, the door to the grand hall opened and Mrs. Lopez stepped inside. Her appearance was as dignified as always, but there was a softness in her expression that Clara had never seen before. "Mrs. Lopez," Clara said, her voice tentative but respectful. "I'm glad you could make it." Mrs. Lopez smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, my dear." Her voice was more gentle than Clara had ever heard it before. "I'm glad you're here," Clara replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know things have been difficult between us, but I want you to know that I'm doing this because I love McKinley. He's the man I want to spend my life with." Mrs. Lopez nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions. "I see that now," she said softly. "And I've come to understand something, Clara. I've spent my life focused on things that don't matter: wealth, status, appearances. But what matters most is love. The love you and McKinley share is real, and it's something I now respect." Clara blinked in surprise. She had never expected to hear those words from Mrs. Lopez. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Lopez placed a hand on Clara's arm, her gaze softening. "I've seen the way you two look at each other. I've seen the way McKinley looks at you. That's what matters, Clara. That's what I want for him. For both of you." With a deep breath, Mrs. Lopez finally spoke the words that Clara had been waiting to hear. "I give you my blessing. I know that McKinley has made the right choice. You two deserve to be happy." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief, of joy, and of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. McKinley, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, his face alight with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know this wasn't easy, but it means the world to me." Mrs. Lopez reached out and pulled him into an embrace, the weight of years of unspoken words finally lifting. "I'm proud of you, McKinley," she whispered. "I always have been. I just wanted you to find your happiness." With that, the tension that had once gripped the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of unity. Clara and McKinley, standing together in front of their family, knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they also knew that they had made it through the hardest part together. As they turned toward the altar, hand in hand, Clara smiled. The wedding was about to begin, but in that moment it felt like the beginning of something even greater. A new chapter, built not on wealth or status, but on love, trust, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones you can't see. The day of the wedding had arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Clara stood in front of the mirror, her wedding dress draped around her, the soft fabric flowing like liquid silk. She had never imagined that she would be here, standing in this moment, so many emotions running through her. It felt like a dream, one that had been fraught with doubts, secrets and misunderstandings, but also with love and revelations that had transformed her heart. McKinley had opened up to her in ways she had never expected, revealing his true identity, his reasons for hiding his wealth, and the love he had for her that went beyond any material expectation. Their relationship had faced its hardest tests, but now, standing on the precipice of a new chapter, Clara felt a quiet strength building within her. But even as she stood in this moment, ready to walk down the aisle to marry McKinley, something in her heart told her there was still one more twist ahead. It wasn't the kind of twist that would shake the foundation of their relationship, but one that would make it stronger, one that would solidify the kind of future they both wanted, a future built on integrity, love, and understanding. As the final preparations were made, Clara's mind wandered back to everything that had transpired, the hurt, the healing, the fears, and the growth. She thought about Mrs. Lopez and how she had slowly come to see the truth of Clara and McKinley's relationship, how she had come to accept that love was worth more than status. She thought about McKinley's confession, his deep desire to be seen for who he was rather than what he had. It was as if, with every passing moment, the illusions had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, vulnerable truth. But the greatest revelation came when McKinley had told her that he wanted to give back, to use his wealth not for personal gain, but for causes that mattered. It was an unexpected turn for Clara, but one that made her see him in an entirely new light. The ceremony was held in a grand hall, the air heavy with emotion. As Clara walked down the aisle, her heart raced, her breath steady, but quick. McKinley stood at the altar, his gaze locked on her. His expression was one of quiet awe, as if this moment, this wedding, was the culmination of everything he had ever hoped for. Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of his gaze. It was when the vows were exchanged, the promises made, and the rings slipped onto their fingers that McKinley caught her hand and whispered something that made her heart stop. "I've done something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, just for her ears. Clara's brows furrowed slightly in confusion. "What do you mean?" He smiled, the kind of smile that was both playful and sincere. "Something for us, for our future." Before she could question him further, the officiant continued with the ceremony, the words of their vows filling the air. And though Clara's mind was swirling, it wasn't until the reception that she learned the full extent of McKinley's surprise. Later that evening, as guests milled about the grand ballroom, McKinley pulled Clara aside. He led her to a quiet corner of the room, away from the hustle and bustle, where the two of them could speak freely. "I wanted to do something special," McKinley began, his hands gently holding hers. "Something that shows you who I really am, beyond all the secrets, beyond the wealth, beyond the expectations." Clara's curiosity piqued. She had already been surprised by McKinley's honesty about his wealth, and now there was something else, something more. "What is it?" she asked. McKinley smiled, his eyes filled with a deep affection. "I've made a donation to the charity we both care about, the one that supports underprivileged children in education. I've set up a fund in both our names, one that will ensure future generations have access to the education they deserve." Clara blinked in surprise. Her heart swelled with emotion as she processed what McKinley was saying. A donation, a fund. This wasn't just an impulsive gesture. This was a statement of intent, a reflection of the kind of man McKinley was, of the future he envisioned, not just for them, but for others too. I don't know what to say," Clara stammered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's incredible. I had no idea." McKinley chuckled softly, his hand gently squeezing hers. "I wanted it to be a surprise. I know it's not what you expected, but I think it's a better use of our resources than anything else. It's important to me that we do something meaningful." Tears filled Clara's eyes as she gazed at him, feeling the weight of this gesture. In that moment, she knew that McKinley wasn't just a man hiding behind wealth, trying to avoid being judged by his family or society. He was someone who understood the value of giving back, of helping others, of using his resources to make a difference. And it was this side of him, this side that had been hidden for so long, that had truly won her heart. "McKinley, this is everything I've ever wanted," Clara whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're not just the man I love. You're someone who understands what matters most. I'm so proud to be by your side." McKinley's face softened, his eyes shining with love. "I'm proud of you too. You've helped me become the man I am today. I couldn't ask for a better partner, Clara." In that moment, Clara realized that everything had led to this point, The misunderstandings, the doubts, the revelations, they had all been necessary to bring them to a place where they could truly understand each other. It wasn't just about the wedding or about McKinley's wealth. It was about something far deeper, a bond built on love, trust, and mutual respect. As the night unfolded and the celebration continued, Clara and McKinley stood side by side, hand in hand, knowing that this was just the beginning. The future that had once seemed uncertain, filled with shadows and unanswered questions, now looked clear. They were no longer hiding from who they were, from their families, or from the expectations that had been placed upon them. They had embraced their flaws, their pasts, and their dreams, and together they were ready to face whatever the future held. The wedding had been a beautiful moment, but the true beauty was in the new beginning it marked for Clara and McKinley. They were embarking on a journey that was not defined by wealth, by family pressures, or by materialism, but by the understanding that love, in its purest form, was all that mattered. As they left the wedding ceremony, walking out into the cool evening air, their hands tightly clasped together, Clara felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. This was their life now, and it was theirs to shape. Together, as the story comes to a close, she discovers that true love often comes from the most unexpected places. From the heartbreak of a public divorce to the joy of marrying a stranger who turns out to be a billionaire CEO, she learns that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. The twists and turns of this whirlwind romance prove that fate can be both unpredictable and beautiful. If you've enjoyed this incredible journey with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's always more drama, surprises, and love waiting just around the corner, so stay tuned for more amazing stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.